Okay, so I'm going to, I was a substitute. Somebody called Achille Mbembe was supposed to be speaking here, but now I was very happy to accept the substitution process just last week. So my paper is actually called Thoughts on China's Presence. Thoughts on China's Presence in Africa Today. In the folder that you have, there is a much earlier, about 3 years old, paper published in the journal Agrarian South. It's about notes about imperialism and the current scramble for Africa. That has some of the broad, let's just say, theoretical arguments underlying what I want to say now. Now, okay, so China's presence in Africa. I see the issue of discussing Africa as one big country or one continent. I think one has to think about this in a much more diversified or differentiated manner. We're talking about 55 countries with, there's so many different ways of trying to categorize the continent, whether it's in terms of the kinds of resources, natural, mineral, oil, and so forth, the resources that is offered by the different countries, whether it's by the geopolitical or geopolitical and even military advantages that they pose. This morning I mentioned the difference also about the different layout in terms of settler-colonial settlement, which itself has cultural, racial, and social differentiation of the kinds of issues and linkages, for instance, with the West that it implies, different histories of land alienation and so forth, which define different possibilities for scope of extraction, if you like. So we have to bear in mind this, but nonetheless, I'm still going to have to say something, make some broad statements, and probably throw a few case studies. Now, okay, so if I try to put it on, also linking to Samir's talk earlier and some other discussions we have, I could say that probably we could, not just so much of a caricature, but we could see 3 different types of positions with regard to China's presence in Africa. The first one we can call the recolonization thesis. This is posited by many liberal Western scholars and heavily floated in the media, that Africa is being recolonized, particularly by China. But it has a popular resonance to some extent, insofar as the street trade and so forth is increasingly occupied and dominated or competing with new Chinese traders, small and medium enterprises that come into play. And of course, given also that Africa was literally opened up in the 90s, and the new manufacturer, global manufacturer is in fact China. In fact, the space for that kind of trade, retail, on the street is fairly much open to Chinese and so forth. There are also elements of this thesis, because it has a sort of an academic, but improperly conceptualized, because we cannot talk about recolonization in the classical sense of the notion of colonization. We have to find another terminology to discuss what the relationship is. But basically, the popular and even some of the academic studies emphasize the negatives of wage relations, the conditions, and so forth. Although many studies that we have seen also when comparing Western companies and China don't necessarily bear the fact that it's a consistent relationship in favor of or against the Chinese. There are questions of racism and so forth. Rupert also just mentioned this. These are all parts of the contradictions and perceptions of Chinese presence in Africa. But by and large, the recolonization thesis assumes or implies a dominance of Chinese capital and Chinese influence on African states and so forth. Now, this is far from the truth, I think. If we look empirically at the situation on the ground, we have an increased presence and involvement of China, but in relative terms, compared to capital in general, and so forth, this is not the case. That's what I would like to argue. Second perspective on Africa is one which, to some extent, is implied by, is advanced by, I don't like the word elites, but more or less some of the governments and some left scholars perceive the increased presence of China in the financial side and in the occupation of certain sectors which had been abandoned by the development banks and so forth from the 50s, 60s even, as creating what Samir Amin calls the room of maneuver, creating spaces and the possibilities of the ping-pong diplomacy and so forth, okay? And that this may be seen in a positive light, especially in a context, not only in the context of financing, but also, for example, at the level of the UN Security Council, the role of China in decisions, probably giving cover to some countries which have been under pressure from certain Western regime change agendas. So on the economic, and so this would be another argument. Now, a third argument that we advance is that, and contrary to just a bit, the discussion that we had earlier just put me off a bit, but I don't want to get too engaged in it. But basically, we can, we can say that we view, I would say, that Africa is actually facing a classical scramble. There's a classical scramble for land, mineral, natural resources. I'm talking about water, forest resources, and the lot. Even if we don't use the notion of frontier in terms of natural resources, but and markets. So it's classical as it's a scramble insofar as it involves the export of new capital, of capital, surplus capital, of transnationals, following the crises that have emerged. I mean, beginning, of course, in 2001, we see the presence of China increasing after the 2001, the Middle East conflicts and the wars there, with the energy crises and the food crises, and then the financial crisis. All of these together create conditions for capital export with Africa, not only Africa, but different parts of the South being the destination of this scramble. So on the one hand, we have this transnational capital. On the other hand, you have an active, in a classical sense, active involvement of states. The states, not only as state capital, as SOEs or companies and so forth, but the diplomatic maneuver and establishment and broadening of diplomatic connections from the BRICS, for instance, including an increased state soft power and diplomatic power and pressures. And thirdly, we have what we could call, we see as an incipient reshaping of the military, the security architecture of Africa. Okay? And so insofar as, I will elaborate, but basically the creation of an African command and a new presence of the US basically in construction. So the military power, state, the state itself and the corporations from these different regions, countries, the sources of capital, are in competition to gain control and influence the exploitation of these resources. Okay, so this is how I would see it, and within that context, we have to think in the short term, in the longer term, to what extent, say, the military security situation itself shifts and what it implies. Okay. So I think that, you know, so this would be the argument that I would pose to say that we need to think different about it generally. And also, we should bear in mind the context facing the continent beyond the questions that I've raised about the capital and the military and so forth, militarization. The fact that the semi-peripheries, there was a discussion about semi-peripheries, the middle. we have a much larger, I'm still sort of in the center-periphery framework, sorry, we have an expansion of the number of semi-peripheries within the Asian context, in the Middle East, in Turkey, all the number of countries that have a capacity in different scales to get involved in the scramble has grown. And so in actual fact, from the Gulf and so forth, we can see different interventions and so forth. So this is an important shift in the context. And secondly, we cannot talk about the context in 2000. We are talking about independent nation states, not the earlier scramble, which in fact entailed a process of colonization and in fact shaping the regime, not only the mode of rule, but also the nature of the economies. Here we're talking of independent states, and in this respect, much of the debate veers towards discussions about the relative corruption or lack of corruption and good governance that the Chinese and Indians probably ignore. But of course, this is also difficult to sustain if we look at recent reports about illicit flows of resources out of Africa, largely destined to big multinationals, through multinationals from the West, in addition to the East. It's difficult to sustain that position. So in this context, how can we characterize in more specific details, the presence of China? Now, first of all, I think that it's important to understand that many of the studies that we see available either restrict themselves to a very narrow view of a sector, like the oil sector, energy, construction, and even so, many of the studies study the new scramblers, the new China or India, on their own. But when you look cumulatively at many of the countries, right, you find that the picture shifts. For example, in other words, the point I want to make here is that, in my view, if we, despite the fact that the trade gross, looking at China individually and the US and so forth, has grown, cumulatively and collectively, Anglo-American, Euro-American investments, historical and current, are still dominant in the African scene. I still would like, I think that we can look at this carefully, that in some countries, especially some of the oil countries where you have new investments in which China is involved, that the balance might actually shift in terms of China's actual presence and influence, might actually shift in favor of China. But by and large, in most of the countries, right, this Anglo-American, Euro-American capital is the dominant player. And I think that it's important for many reasons of unraveling some of the theses that have been advanced. And actually, I have looked, for instance, we have looked at data on land as one of the key sources of scramble. If you put all the China, India, plus all the other semi-peripheries, Turkey and blah, 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 Gulf and so forth, they constitute less than 40% of the attempted land grabs, and the actual land grabs, because in many cases you have numerous multinational companies from America, Europe, even new European countries that were never involved, Norway and Scandinavia. You have a whole rush of all sorts of different Europeans, German and all sorts of countries that are now involved. Okay? So and in which sectors? I've mentioned land, for instance, but I mentioned retail earlier as an increasingly dominated by Chinese exports in the context of a deindustrialization that began in the 90s, late 80s and so forth. So much of the goods that we can see, the Chinese playing a dominant role in supplying basic consumer goods and so forth, This is an area. In mining, in oil and minerals, if you take countries like Angola, Nigeria, and so forth, the dominant force in Angola is French, American oil interests are dominant. So you have new deals that come on different conditions in some of these countries, financing conditions, that pose China as a threat to the established model, increase the room of play for these governments in terms of concessions, but that do not necessarily end in a dominance of China in those countries. Even if it's the case that in some countries, for instance, India, if you take in Ethiopia, for instance, it's the dominant grabber of land, all right? It's the dominant sort of new actor. But, you know, got American. If you take Sudan, it's the American companies in the north, in the Sudan, and the South Sudan. So, sorry, I have a difficulty referring to these countries as two different countries, even though it's a fact of life. And so if we go, if we take in terms of mining, Chinese capital is there increasingly, for instance, in countries such as Zimbabwe, chrome, a little bit of platinum and so forth. But South African, American, British, Australian companies would be dominant in platinum, for instance, a very critical resource in countries such as Zimbabwe. And so I could go on, but you know, the point I think is made. And you know, however, China, when it comes to the construction of new infrastructure, rehabilitation of energy, roads, new roads, railways, and so forth, it's the dominant game in the African town, because you know that's where, for the last 10 years, we have seen new financing and major projects. Angola, you know, there was a fight over the same in DRC with the World Bank and IMF, you know, trying to stop this. But Zambia, you increasingly in a number of countries in the infrastructural side. So, you know, this is significant. The presence of China on its own is very significant in terms of the economic, political scenario, but it's not necessarily dominant. And also the question is, the critique is that, and this is, I think, is valid, that there is a lot of corruption in some of the deals with the elite and so forth, taking backhanders. But I would like to think that the question of the good governance has not been applied to an assessment of all these capitals from these different sources, okay? So now, moving from their presence and in different sectors, if we think about solidarity issues and so forth, I want to say that probably this has not taken center stage in the relationship, although there are significant cases where China would have played a role. I've mentioned in cases where you have a regime change projects, like Sudan, Zimbabwe, yeah? China has been critical in trying to give political cover, but in some of the cases, it has not gone all the way out. A country like Zimbabwe, just to say, isolated under sanctions, has been one of the few, or some of the few countries that have pronounced the look east policy as a way of pulling from the West, or counterposing or playing the game. And China has supported, in terms of certain types of political cover, the UN Security Council, but has not necessarily gone all the way in filling the financing gap in these countries. And so there are also some contradictions in, you know, complex ways in which we should look at this. And moreover, if we look at, besides the official rise of the official cultural activities, language, the institutes, the language training and education of some people, which is important, and opening up to train Africans and so forth. The balance, the balance of export of this training is still in the West, and increasingly in countries like South Africa, So, so we have to take a little bit of a more complex view of how this particular instrument, how it plays out. And in spite of this kind of support, we can say that there is still, the question of racism was raised, there's still a creation of same kind of social enclaves, economic enclaves within the Chinese communities on the continent. And it's very significant, the integration, just a little bit like the settler colonial enclaves in some of the continent, where, and you have, despite some intermarriages and so forth, but there's you have a kind of a separation, and this is a problem. And given the media that is also xenophobic, because there is a lot of xenophobic material coming from media sources and so forth, and so I don't want to go into psychological theories about all that, but the point is that there is a reinforcement of xenophobia, which in some cases reflects certain factual, empirically observable tendencies, but probably overstated, and so forth. And so finally, the last point about the presence, I don't know how I'm doing with time. Please feel free to tell me.
Have you 10 minutes?
10 minutes, oh, very good.
You can proceed.
So my fourth big point that I wanted to make is that, because this is some of the questions that were being asked, what are the major conflicts that have arisen? I say by far the major conflict, what I could call a sort of geopolitical confrontations. I mean, well, there are different perspectives, for instance, about what happened in Ivory Coast. Okay, the origin of the war in the earlier, more than 15 years ago, but its resolution in the last 5 years, one of the perspectives is that it reflects a contest between French, American capital in the established cocoa and industry and business, and a new rivalry between Western firms, oil firms, and Chinese firms which were getting concessions. In the same place, Ghana, which was also caught up in almost giving a concession to China in oil, ended up turning around on that to the state neighboring countries. So that French intervention, military intervention in favor of one of the political parties, in which you have a judgment of whether the elections rules and good governance is okay or not okay. But this military intervention is partly rooted in this rivalry. Similarly, we can say the same about Sudan. Roughly, Mahmoud knows more about that, but in my view, the presence of different, not only Chinese, Russian, and capital from the West and so forth, rivalry over the mineral resources. This is an important part, and the kind of militarization and some of the conflict that has happened there largely relates to this. Which one? The Libya is the other case, the very obvious case, where, right? So that's one of the big. Second level of Zimbabwe is a very unique case, I think, which is worth thinking about. Simply because it's not necessarily a country which has the most prized resources that China requires. I mean, or required at a certain time, oil, gas. It has quite a lot of minerals, different types, some uranium, not mine, platinum, and so on and so forth. But to some extent, between the South African political cover, South Africa played some role, significant role in providing political cover to Zimbabwe against the regime change from the West, the sanctions, even an attempt to militarily intervene. Between the South Africans and the Chinese, support in the Security Council, as well as in giving minimal loans and to support the financing of the economy. This, in fact, enabled the Zimbabwe question to escape a regime change agenda. But of course, this happened in the Southern African context, in which you have a defense pact. It's one of the only regional cooperation, economic cooperation that has a formal defense pact signed, a pact which was signed after the Great War, African War, they call it, I don't know the different names, the war in Congo, DRC, where countries such as Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia went in defense of an American-sponsored invasion by yours truly, Rwanda and Uganda. So the rebels, with one of our professor friends was the political leader of this movement, Wamba. Not Mahmoud, but but the thing is that even that war, the Great War, was an arena of a contest, in the sense that if you think historically, South Africa, in Southern Africa, and the DRC, still looking at Southern Africa, and then Kenya, were the critical security pillars of the NATO strategy, through the dictatorship of Mobutu and so forth. Once there was a takeover, that area was destabilized. It sort of undermined the security, stability of, Similarly, the independence, South Africans don't like to call it independence, majority rule in South Africa, or democracy in South Africa, unraveled the security regime, or in other words, it became less dependable. With the new Africans in town, you can't trust these niggers, you know, and with the instability in Zimbabwe, land reform and revolutionaries. So the security pillars of that region were beginning to shake, and with some of these countries supporting, defending the DRC, but at the same time, these are countries which are important recipients of Chinese finance and support in different forms, Angola and so forth, and Zimbabwe, right? And the DRC, as I said, yeah? So the conflicts, they are also significant, but scattered and isolated conflicts, which arise through labor strikes and movements and so forth. You know, countries like Zambia, and you know, here and there, the question of the wages and the conditions and so forth. These government regulation and negotiations, you know, for instance, Zambia was threatening to nationalize, to renationalize the Chinese mines, but you know, they backed off after a very short. So you have conflicts around these kinds of issues, but they are less global in terms of the politics of those countries. They are important and scattered issues, and there are discussions about the labor regulations with foreign capital. Some of the countries have, you see what happened, you have to think about China or whoever we're thinking about in the last 15 years. As I said, the whole continent had liberalized, more or less opened up all the arms and everything. Not only to trade, play with the numbers. You see the presence of all these actors, British capital, Chinese and so forth, from Ethiopia coming, Tanzania, Zambia, and so forth. So you have, in the land grab side, major problems in those regions or sites where the grabbing is happening, of the displacement of people from land, okay? And an incipient commoditization of land, comrade. The creation, primitive accumulation, right? Beyond the expanded reproduction of capital. A process of extra economic, compelled drawing in of land into the markets, into commodity relations. Increased wage labor relations in some of those localities, but not, but why is there these struggles? We have to look at this in another way, because there is also a lot of resistance in a number of the countries that we talk about. So I said that there are about 8 to 12 countries. So if you look at the records, in the last 15 years, there have been quite a number of land grab attempts that have been reversed, yeah, because of internal resistances of different sorts and conflict, like Tanzania. Ethiopia, even if there's more land listed for grabbing, or which was trying to be grabbed, but that is not being, so there are actually struggles. So, we know that capital expands in terms of uneven and combined development. But we have to look at resistance. No, it's important because, for example, the whole land tenure system, customary land tenure, despite all its exclusions in terms of belonging and so forth, in itself is an institution in a line of defense which is under attack, okay, by some of these land expropriations. Because the land grabbing is taking customary lands, converting customary lands into leasehold, tradable lands, marketable lands. And this process is not happening uniformly across the continent. In many of the countries, it just can't happen unless, even with military authoritarian governments, sort of the Gambia and places like, the pace of commoditization of land is constrained by the resistance and so forth. And so just to conclude now, so how should we think about the future? We have a friend called Issa Shivji, who, Issa Shivji has proposed that African countries should rethink and re-engage the idea of non-alignment in a new framework of the contemporary global, to see in which case even the so-called cooperation and investments have to be looked at on a case-by-case, but based on the principles, certain principles